I can still hear the pop of the champagne cork. The scent of lemon butter and grilled salmon floated through the ballroom. Our servers, some with us for over 10 years, moved between the round tables like a well-rehearsed routine. The walls were adorned with framed photos. Opening day, our first feature in Bon Appetit, the ribbon cutting at our third location. It was our 25th anniversary, a quarter century of Sorella, the family restaurant I'd devoted my entire adult life to. We were celebrating in a hotel ballroom in Chicago, the same city where our first restaurant opened its doors in 1999. I had just turned 36 and had been running the business since I was 26, stepping in after my father's heart attack. At first, I was just supposed to keep things running, but I stayed, expanded, and turned Sorella into something far bigger than anyone had expected. So when my Uncle Frank tapped his glass and stood up to speak, I assumed I knew what was coming. A tribute to my dad, maybe even a kind mention of me, but instead he turned to my cousin David. "I want to take a moment," he said, beaming, "to acknowledge someone with incredible potential, someone who truly grasps what Sorella means to this family, the future of this brand, the one who will carry us into the next 25 years. My son David." There was a brief silence, then applause. I scanned the room. The clapping spread fast. My aunt, my cousins, even two of the investors I'd brought in years ago. The lawyer we hired for the Arizona expansion raised his glass. I just blinked. David smiled with that rehearsed humility. I saw right through it. I forced a polite smile and sipped my drink. The bitterness stung sharper than the alcohol. It was the smile you give when you've just been voted out of your own legacy without so much as a warning. I made an excuse to step outside, said I had a call. What I really needed was air. For 10 years, I had given everything: nights, weekends, relationships. I missed birthdays, turned down 2 national corporate job offers, and drained my retirement fund to open our second location. I was the one who secured the airport contract, stayed up writing press pitches that got us into food and wine, and co-signed credit lines when nobody else would. David, he'd joined 2 years ago, did part-time marketing, made a few flashy TikToks, suggested a logo refresh, and showed up to a zoning meeting, where he fell asleep halfway through. But he was Frank's son. And Frank, as my dad's older brother, still clung to the illusion that he was the rightful head of the business. Later that night, I returned to the ballroom. Everyone was chatting and laughing. Someone had already started serving cake. I didn't confront anyone. I just kept smiling, took a few photos, and let them think I didn't care, because they had no idea what they had just done. They didn't know that I had prepared for this. 4 years earlier, during our Austin launch, I brought in my own legal team and insisted on reviewing all franchise documents personally. They thought I was being overly cautious. But I wasn't paranoid. I was ready. The next morning, I arrived at our flagship location in River North at 6:45 a.m., as I always did on Mondays. It gave me time to review invoices and prep for the weekly ops meeting. At 7:30, Frank and David walked in. Their expressions told me everything. "Sophie," Frank began, no trace of shame on his face, "we've decided it's time for a leadership change. David will be taking over as managing director." I didn't flinch. I quietly closed my laptop, stood up, and looked them in the eye. "All right," I said, "but you might want to reread the franchise agreements before getting too comfortable." David narrowed his eyes. "Why?" I walked to the file cabinet, pulled out a folder, and tapped a paragraph I had highlighted years ago. "Because if I'm removed from operational leadership without cause," I said evenly, "those contracts are immediately subject to review and potentially void under the non-compete clause." Frank's face paled. David just stared. They were clueless, but they were about to get educated. David's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. Frank leaned over to read with him, eyes narrowing as he skimmed the legalese. Section 7.4. Leadership Clause. In cases of leadership transition involving removal of the operational director without due cause, the franchise license shall be placed under legal scrutiny, with full discretionary rights belonging to the original operational signatory. They clearly hadn't read it. "You're bluffing," Frank muttered. I raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" I pulled another folder from my bag. This is a legal summary, prepared by the same attorney who vetted all 4 of our franchise agreements. Her number's on the inside cover. Feel free to call. David's face drained of color. Wait, this clause lets you suspend operations? If I'm removed without board approval and without documented cause, I said calmly, then yes, which neither of you have. You're not on the board, Frank snapped. True, I said, but I control franchise ops. You signed that over in 2019 when I personally financed our expansion. You needed the capital. No bank would touch us back then. Frank fell silent. I could see the gears turning, trying to recall what he'd signed. But I had been 10 steps ahead for years. David looked ill. So what does this mean? It means, I said, if you try to push me out, I can legally pause all franchise activity. Vendors, supply chains, kitchen licensing, staffing contracts, everything. David opened his mouth, then shut it again. Frank still glared at me. You expected this? He asked quietly. I nodded. I didn't think it was guaranteed, just possible. Not because I believed you were malicious, just entitled. You always treated Sorella like a family heirloom, but it wasn't passed down to me. I built it. Frank gave a bitter laugh. You think you're the only one who sacrificed for this family? No, I said, but I'm the only one who turned a struggling business into a multi-million-dollar brand, while the rest of you cashed dividend checks. He stepped toward me. Don't start a war. I met his gaze. Then don't try to. I left the office without another word. Instead of returning to my desk, I drove straight to my attorney's office downtown. She greeted me at the door. I had a feeling you'd show up, she said, waving me in. They actually tried it, I said, collapsing into the chair. They tried to force me out. She nodded and pulled out a legal pad. Do you want to keep this quiet or take it public? I paused. Start quiet, but be ready to go loud. I left her office with a signed affidavit and copies of all 4 franchise agreements. When I got back to the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted. Staff were whispering. Luis, our general manager, gave me a silent nod. He'd heard. The fight had begun. But what Frank and David didn't know was, I wasn't just fighting to keep a title. I was protecting everything I had spent 10 years building. From the very people who thought they could take it and walk away clean. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom at exactly 9 a.m. The air felt heavier than usual, tense, formal. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the lights, and every chair was filled, except mine. I took my seat at the far end. Across from me sat Frank, with David at his side. David looked nervous, and he had every reason to be. He was in way over his head, and deep down he knew it. But Frank? He looked smug, confident, like the vote was already in his pocket. One by one, the board members greeted me with tight professional nods, neutral, guarded. Then, Charles Mitchell, our board chair, cleared his throat. I believe we all understand the purpose of this meeting, he said crisply. There's a dispute over the managing director role. Dispute? I murmured. Interesting choice of word. He ignored me. Frank, since your team initiated this discussion, please begin. Frank stood up, carefully buttoning his jacket like it gave him credibility. Let me start by acknowledging Sophie's commitment, he said. She's worked hard, no doubt. But we believe a new chapter calls for new leadership, someone with fresher vision, stronger media presence, and a better grasp of what today's market demands. He gestured to David. My son has been working closely with our branding and marketing teams. His campaigns have driven huge online engagement and attracted a younger demographic. This is the kind of innovation we need. I let him finish, then I stood. Thanks, Frank, I said calmly. Now let's deal with facts. I tapped the screen on the conference table. Behind me, a display lit up with performance data, growth curves, and franchise expansion timelines. In the last decade, we've grown from a struggling single-location restaurant to a multi-market brand valued at over $5 million. That didn't happen because of hashtags or trending sounds. It came from long-term strategy, risk analysis, operational discipline, and a team I handpicked and developed. I turned to the board. I didn't inherit Sorella, I rebuilt it, contract by contract, hire by hire, crisis by crisis. David was visibly sweating. But forget all that for a moment, I continued. Let's talk legalities. I brought up another document. This is the updated franchise agreement from 2019, reaffirmed in 2021. It explicitly requires board review and documented cause for any operational leadership change. None of that happened here. The room was dead quiet. I know some of you have known Frank for decades. I respect that. But allowing this kind of maneuver sets a dangerous precedent. I paused and let the next line hit. If I walk today, every franchise license walks with me. The gasp wasn't dramatic, it was real. Charles leaned in. You're saying you'd revoke them? I'm saying, I replied, you'd be left with buildings, no infrastructure, no operations, and no recognizable brand. Frank leapt up. This is extortion! No, I said coldly. This is how business works, the kind you've forgotten how to do. Charles cleared his throat. Let's move to a vote. Frank sat back smug again. Too smug. That's when I knew he'd gotten to someone. Votes came in, 4 for David, 3 for me, 2 abstained, 1 left. All eyes turned to Elise, our finance director. She had always played it safe, always neutral. She looked at me, then at David, then down at her screen. I vote in favor of Sophie. Frank slammed his hand on the table. Elise! She didn't flinch. I've worked with both of them. Only one knows what they're doing. Final tally 5-4. I had won, barely. As I gathered my tablet, I looked David in the eye. You didn't lose because you're young, I said quietly. You lost because you skipped the part where you earn it. Then I turned to Frank. And you? You forgot who was keeping your name on the sign? The vote was over. I had won. But I didn't feel victorious. Not really. It felt fragile, like a victory made of glass. Frank wouldn't just walk away. And David? He wasn't going to disappear. 2 days later, I found out what they were planning next. The first article dropped. Leadership rift at Sorella. Sources say founder's daughter refused to step down. It hit local business blogs first, then national restaurant sites. It was full of vague sources and cleverly crafted half-truths. It portrayed me as controlling, difficult, unwilling to embrace modern leadership or share credit with the next generation. No mention of the vote. No mention of the contracts. Nothing about the decade I spent resurrecting this company. Just quotes like, some insiders say she runs the place like a dictatorship. Others feel the brand needs a more youthful, forward-looking voice. I clenched my fist at my desk. Frank was doing what he did best, rewriting the story. And this time, he had help. The phone started ringing, investors, some polite, others not. Should we be worried about instability? Is this why San Diego's launch stalled? Is it true you blocked hiring a marketing director because you felt threatened? I answered every question calmly, professionally, but inside I was seething. Later that evening, Luis knocked quietly on my office door. Word is, he said, Frank's calling around, vendors, department heads, asking if they deal with David directly. I sighed. Of course he is. And one more thing. Luis looked uncomfortable. A few newer front-of-house staff didn't show up today. The ones David hired. Might not be a coincidence. It wasn't. It was a message. Frank couldn't beat me in the boardroom. So now he was going to try to erode me from within. But what he didn't know was I'd already survived worse. Lawsuits, fires, a pandemic. He wanted a public battle? Fine. The next morning, I issued a press release, short, factual, firm. Sorella confirms its leadership remains unchanged following a routine board decision. Sophie Harper will continue as managing director. Under her leadership, Sorella has expanded to 4 markets and grown 350% over the past 10 years. The board remains fully confident in her strategic direction. Then I made a call to a friend who produced a regional business segment. 3 days later, I sat across from a studio anchor. "What's your secret?" he asked, smiling. I smiled back. Relentless work, strategic planning, and learning when to block out the noise. He laughed. Sounds like a subtle dig at some recent headlines. If doing my job well makes me difficult, I said evenly, I can live with that. The interview aired that evening, and for the first time in weeks, the tide began to turn. Investors stopped calling. Customers started reaching out with messages of support. Our Instagram activity spiked, not because of David's trendy ideas, but because people respect perseverance. Not everyone was thrilled. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. Enjoy the spotlight. You've made enemies. I stared at the message, then deleted it. Not because it didn't shake me, but because fear was the whole point. This wasn't about management or branding anymore. Frank and David wanted to break me, publicly and personally. But they forgot one thing. I had already survived the hardest part, building everything from nothing. Now, I was just protecting it. And I wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the board vote and media storm, while the dust was finally beginning to settle, I wasn't. I was still working long hours, still walking the kitchen line at peak hours, still reviewing supplier contracts before dawn. But now I wasn't driven by fear. I was clear. If I wanted true peace, I couldn't just defend what I'd built. I had to shut the door behind them. For good. It began with one quiet call to Elise, our finance director. I want a full internal audit, I told her. Keep it quiet, look back 5 years. She didn't ask why, she simply said, understood. I had my suspicions. There had been signs over the years, small things. Frank had always kept the original Chicago supplier accounts under his purview. They were legacy contracts. I hadn't pressed the issue out of respect, or maybe misplaced loyalty. Now I knew better. 2 days later, Elise walked into my office carrying a thick folder. I didn't think you were right, she said. But you were. She dropped the file onto my desk. Inside were invoices, discrepancies, and evidence of vendor kickbacks. Nothing criminal, but unethical. And it clearly violated our internal code of conduct. Frank had been channeling portions of supplier rebates to a separate company, one he owned, that billed us for vague consulting services. And David? His name was on several of those invoices too. I sat in silence for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone. Elise, I said, still holding the folder. Notify the board. We're calling a vote for removal. She asked, just Frank? I looked at David's signature on the documents. Both. 1 week later, we convened again in the boardroom. Frank entered looking combative. David just looked drained. I know what this is, Frank said before anyone else could speak. This is revenge. No, I replied calmly. This is accountability. You taught me that, remember? I passed copies of the audit results around the table. I didn't need a long speech. The numbers said enough. Misuse of funds, false reimbursements, unauthorized payouts. David tried to defend himself. Said he just signed what his father gave him, that he didn't know. I believed him. But that didn't mean I was going to shield him. The vote was swift, effective immediately. Frank and David were removed from all roles and stripped of privileges within Sorella. Frank's shares were frozen pending investigation. David's severance was denied. It was over, but I wasn't done. That weekend, I gathered the entire team at the flagship restaurant. No media, no filters, just us. I want to be clear, I said, standing in front of the kitchen. This place isn't mine because my last name is Harper. It's mine because I showed up when no one else did. Because I worked the fryers during staff shortages and mopped floors when the dishwasher quit mid-shift. I paused, scanning the room. You all did the same, and we're still here, together. Applause erupted, not polite, not political, real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt relief. Epilogue. A year later, Sorella crossed $10 million in revenue. We launched in 2 more cities. We started a leadership program for women in the culinary industry. And our board? Transparent, responsible, solid. Frank never reached out again. David did once, a short email. You were right, I wasn't ready. I didn't respond. Because closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from walking away from people who only show up when there's credit to claim. Now, when I walk through the original Chicago kitchen, I don't feel resentment. I feel pride. Not because I won, but because I stood my ground when everyone expected me to fold. Because I proved, not to them, but to myself, that strength isn't something you inherit. You build it, shift by shift, contract by contract, decision by decision. So when someone asks how I stopped my company from being stolen, I'll tell them this. I didn't fight to keep power. I fought to protect what I built from people who thought they could claim it without earning it. And that's a fight I'll never apologize for.